Hi, my name is Bruce Bolger, and I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and we're dedicated to helping organizations optimize their performance through people through the same strategic and systematic approach that was developed years ago by Demings and Peter Drucker to get everybody's interest harmonized and focused on the organization's purpose, goals, and objectives. And as part of our pledge to spread the word, we give away a lot of great information. And we're lucky to have people, experts in various fields, who are willing to give up some time to share their expertise. And today we're going to talk about the ROI of DEI and what many organizations have got wrong and what they can do to make it right. And then we will discuss, of course, the current state of affairs and what companies have to watch out for with three people who are at the front lines from different perspectives. Dorian Nunez, he's co-founder of Omni Research. It's an organization that promotes education of research, pardon me, research finance, especially for students, business schools, business students, and other activities. And you can clarify that if you want, Dorian, when you're talking. Alan Schweier, he's principal of human capital for the conference board. I've known Alan for years, and he's done a lot of work in the area of the impact of DEI, and he is involved with the institute at the conference board that is involved with DEI issues. And finally, we have Eric Darasaw. He is on the board of probably the largest ESG-oriented investment organization in the world, I would think, Eric, and that's the Interfaith. You give us the exact. I always forget the
The
exact.
Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility.
Thank you so much, Eric. And he is also the ETF advisor for the NACP Impact Fund. So he's got a real perspective from the investor's standpoint. I just want to quickly say before we get to our conversation here today, we're an organization with a lot of companies that try to help companies like yours improve the engagement of their stakeholders in all sorts of different ways. And finally, we are a stakeholder capitalist organization. We are the how-to organization of implementation, and you don't have to join, pay anything. We give away information like the great information that you're going to get today, thanks to our speakers. So, Eric, I'm going to start with you because I think you come with a very interesting perspective. You got your career you started in the whole anti-apartheid area, and you were very much involved with that. But when we started working together in 2021 or so, you were taking a different perspective on the whole issue in terms of corporations. And you were very much focused back then on really the investment benefits, the business opportunities, the value creation opportunities. Could you kind of explain how you came to realize that getting companies focused on the value of DEI is a little bit different than, say, the issues related to apartheid?
Well, I would say this. We don't have a lot of time to really go in depth into the issue, but the issue of value has actually been the issue that's been debated for decades, right? Even in the anti-apartheid era. The battle centered around global corporate support of extractive practices of the apartheid government, the exploitation of black labor, right? The perceived plundering and extraction of rich mineral resources support global industries. So the question during that era was, uh, should investors divest from these corporations or constructively engage and reform those corporate practices? From an investor perspective, what would be the impact of U.S. Investors and global investors selling their holdings in corporations doing business in South Africa that's extracting value? What's the impact on my portfolio returns? And, if we engage those corporations, are there a set of principles that would guide companies doing business in South Africa? And that's where you had the creation of the Global Sullivan Principles. And the Global Sullivan Principles were guidelines on how corporations should constructively engage in South Africa, and it eventually became the basis for the UN Global Compact that was introduced by Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the UN, as well as Reverend Leon Sullivan. And then that eventually, evolved into UN Principles for Responsible Investing, which is a $121 trillion coalition looking to align values, right, with corporate practices for the purposes of value creation. So this is not new. One final comment I'll make: the idea of double bottom line investing. Can I focus in on financial returns and, in fact, receive other collateral benefits uh, uh, at the same time? And the principle of double bottom line investing has been around for many, many years. I know my colleague, Mr. Nunez, could talk extensively about this, but let me stop there.
Well, anyway, so thank you, guys. So I think the important you're making with the Sullivan principles, which I believe go back to the 80s, is the idea that, okay, you can boycott and then people can make that choice. But why don't we also constructively engage? Why don't we discuss how we can actually have a double bottom line? And how can we actually improve the performance of our organization by having a double bottom line? So, Alan, that brings me to you. First off, I'm going to ask you a little bit later on about what the research tells us about having diverse customers, shareholders and stakeholders. But first, maybe give us an update. Where does things stand right now with DEI? What kind of is safe, and where is it not safe from the Trump administration's threats point of view?
Um, well, it's evolving, but if we look at it right now, you have to look at you have to do an assessment in your organization uh, in a variety of different ways. So, what we advise leaders to do is to work with their counsel, internal counsel, if they don't have expertise, deep expertise in employment law, especially around DEI, to maybe bring in external counsel as well, and to look at their DEI programs, really initiative by initiative, to understand where they land in terms of two types or three types of risk, really: legal risk, reputational risk being your reputation should you be targeted uh, by an anti-DEI activist group, for example, and your reputational risk should you go too far in adjusting your DEI programs and compromise your values and promises to employees and other stakeholders. So kind of think of it as two risks: reputational and legal, but reputational itself has two components that you have to consider. Legal risk is a little unclear because the new administration hasn't made it crystal clear as to what they consider to be illegal DEI. There are court challenges in the works right now that could definitely expand the definition of what constitutes illegal DEI. That's already happened in 2023 a little bit with the Supreme Court decision affecting college admissions. Now, that doesn't have a direct legal bearing on the workforce, but it certainly has a bearing on the workforce. And we've seen that quite clearly. Um, I think in terms of legality, organizations need to look at things that they might have done in the past, such as, let's start with the most questionable practice: setting quotas. Very few organizations actually set quotas. And by that, I mean, we're going to have 50% women in senior executive positions by 2027, let's say. Um, they could do that to some degree, but it required a great deal of justification. Now you can't do that. That would be definitely considered illegal. You would probably face some type of Justice Department investigation if you did that. The you also should be very careful even talking publicly about targets. There's nothing illegal about saying your goal is to have 50% women in senior leadership positions by 2027. But the problem there is this could raise red flags with those who are looking at these things. We see the Starbucks, Robbie Starbuck and groups like that, um, attacking organizations in the social media, even organizing boycotts and that type of thing. So that's an example of legal and reputational. Another thing that you've got to be careful about is if in the past you looked at research and you said, well, you know, we don't want a quota, but we want to have more of this demographic in leadership positions. Let's stick with women. So the research for years has said that probably the greatest impact initiative you could run would be an organized sponsorship program, mentorship, but even more sponsorship, where a senior person might, take you under the wing and help you with your career. If you make that program for women only, you are going to run into some trouble, most likely. What you need to do is say that program's open to anyone who's interested. Same thing with employer resource groups or business resource groups, affinity groups. You don't want to now, in this climate, say that there is a group that is closed only to a certain portion of the organization. It needs to be open to all. Um, so those are the sorts of things that organizations have to look at. And I can go into a lot more examples of this. We've published a zone 1 to zone 4 risk chart that I could share with you after, Bruce, but every organization's got to do this for themselves.
Well, thank you very much, and we're going to get back to you shortly on, the value creation of having a diverse organization. But the summary to me, before we move on for everybody, is that essentially you can't have quotas. If you're going to have any type of groups, they've got to be open to all, and that you can indeed promote having a diverse and equitable organization, but you have to try to do so in a way that doesn't smack of preferential treatment. And we all have to remember that this is all under an executive order, Alan. That means the next president of the United States could write another executive order and all of this goes away, correct? There's no legislation. This is an executive order, and therefore, on the first day of the next presidency, all of this could be gone if there is another presidency.
Yeah, if there are challenges in the courts and they go through all the way to the Supreme Court, then it becomes more permanent. Doesn't mean it couldn't ever be changed, but
Well, great point. And Congress could go in and institutionalize these changes. So
yes.
I did not mean to say that. Obviously, it's in flux. Dorian,
Yeah.
you have a very interesting perspective on this. You and colleagues are basically saying that the anti-woke um, sort of hysteria actually was accidentally, really, in some ways, facilitated by boards. That boards of directors did not really understand, the focus on DEI. And this is my view, but I want to hear your view. And that instead, there was a lot of virtue signaling and a lot of wasted talk and effort, and that boards were not really prepared to deal with meaningful value creation through DEI. But what's your point on the role of boards, in case I've
Yeah,
got that?
well, Bruce, first I want to say thanks for holding this again, because you're right. Our article from 4 years ago, we look like Nostradamus almost. So, in pointing out a lot of this, and thank you for having this forum. I'm glad to meet Alan and to learn more about what the conference board is doing, because that's where the solution lies. When business entities take it seriously and thoroughly, then we're really able to make some systemic change. But our position is pretty simple. That we think the responsibility starts at the board level. It starts at the board level, and it's not just a compliance issue with general counsel. What do we have to do to make sure we don't get sued by the left or by the right? And how do we do it at the lowest cost possible with the maximum return, which may be the way others have done it. It's how do you do it where it has a positive impact? You pointed out very well that EEA and Enterprise Engagement Alliance believes in the talk of Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is a renowned business strategist and business author and writer. And he always said, culture trumps strategy. I'm using Trump euphemistically, but culture beats strategy. And yet you go on any earnings call. I've been on Wall Street 50 years. I've been on a number of earnings calls. And what do they talk about? They talk about strategy. They talk about how they're going to penetrate the market. They have all these discussions about everything. How often do they talk about the corporate culture? So Wall Street's not asking management about culture. The board isn't really thinking about culture. And yet people like Peter Drucker will tell you culture beats strategy. McKinsey, for example, my MBA is from Harvard Business School, and we learned this 40 years ago. McKinsey talks about the need to look at strategy, but that's only one of 7 things you look at. You look at strategy, you look at skills, you look at structure. I'm sure Alan's familiar with the 7S model from McKinsey. And what's in the middle of it? It used to be called superordinate goals, but now it's called shared values. So it all leads to shared value. So what value are we sending when we try to be inclusive? Hopefully it means that we want to have everyone involved, everyone engaged. And we'll talk a little bit why that's so important. So we've gotten away from some basic premises that are business ideas and business functions, and it starts at the board level. So when the board just looks at a compliance issue and they come up with you come up with mediocre responses, and you put yourself in danger of being attacked, which is essentially, part of what has happened. So we think it belongs at the board level. I should, full disclosure, say that a group of my fellow Harvard alums have created a group called the Black and Crimson Passport to Boards that focuses on getting diverse board members from Harvard onto boards so that we can educate and communicate to boards the right way to do this with a focus on business. Last thing I'll say to answer, before you go on, is I'm also a disciple of Michael Porter, and another well-known, well-respected, one of the most prolific writers in business. Everyone talks about his 5 forces and competitive advantage. We all know that, but he also wrote about shared values. And his colleague, Mark Farmer, wrote with him articles about it. And they talk about how important shared values are. And they have I think it's a Shared Value Institute even.
Well, Harvard, Michael Porter developed the shared values concept, and it's at work, and it's really one of the foundations of what we call stakeholder capitalism, where you harmonize the interests of all the stakeholders that produce the wealth.
Exactly.
Without stakeholders, there's no returns for shareholders.
Exactly. And in doing that, you start to create value in the organization by being inclusive, putting everybody to work, and having an inclusive organization. So how often is that part of Michael Porter's research and development recognized, acknowledged, or quoted? I would say not enough. If you survey board members, and maybe Alan, maybe this is something we could do jointly, survey board members and ask them if they've ever heard of or seen or been aware of Porter's work on barriers to entry versus shared values, and see I'd be curious to see the responses that we would get. So it's a blind spot at the board level, and it starts at the board level.
Well, you obviously make a very good point. Eric, you and I witnessed together, and I have you to thank for this, Erica, and I will be lifelong thankful for you. You and I went through the journey together, and I'm not going to mention any names or even because I don't want to hurt anybody, but you and I witnessed greenwashing at its best. And we witnessed companies that all of a sudden, as a response to the murder of George Floyd, all of a sudden felt they need to do things. And a lot of the things turned out to be virtue signaling, flag waving, all sorts of things that did not create value. And that's why 4 years ago we predicted, the EEA did in multiple articles, another one I found today, Dorian, that no, the focus, there's so much value creation. And so that I really want to shift to value creation because, Eric, this is the thing that really amazed me. And remember, you and I, we met with a big group that was focused on this issue of DEI, and we focused on the ROI of DEI. And this group is literally focused on who should they donate money to. I'm not joking. So, but Eric, something that really I struggle with, how you've made a point to me that DEI is a fiduciary responsibility. It's not a compliance issue. And why? Because it is the imperative of any organization to maximize its market, right? To have the best talent, to have the best employees, to have the best supply chain and distribution partners. and to have the broadest possible markets. And we all know that if all of your employees are white, you're going to have a heck of a time employing people from other, ethnicities, right? So doesn't it, before we get into some of the research that Alan will also talk about, doesn't it just make sense to have a highly diverse audience of shareholders also, shareholders, stakeholders? Blacks are huge investors. So doesn't it make sense from a business standpoint? What am I missing? How did this, how could it not be better business to have a diverse organization?
Yeah, I think here's where I think things have went off the rails. The reality of it is that most corporations don't have a real handle on the materiality, the impact and financial materiality of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As Peter Drucker says, that you can't manage what you don't measure. And and a lot of the focus has been on this whole legal compliance issue, right? The organization I serve on the board of, we've conducted these legal and compliance audits of corporations, and the real problem with that, it goes way beyond that. And so what you have is boards of directors making decisions, right, without really understanding the culture, the impact, the financial materiality of DEI. And I think getting back to global standards, mentioned the UN Global Compact, UN Principles Responsible Investment, EU CRD, it's going to require corporations to do double materiality assessments, financial materiality, impact materiality, so they can make a decision on how to move forward. And actually, there's actually agreement on both the right wing and the left wing on this particular issue around how do we measure value creation. And without doing a real assessment of the impact of your decisions, you have corporations that's going at the dismantling of DEI without any real understanding or assessment of value. And until that happens, I think that you're going to have these haphazard, swings in sentiment based upon politics without really doing a deep dive and assessment of what the materiality, financial and otherwise, what the ROI of diversity is. And that has to be done by all of the corporations, which will eventually have an impact on the environmental ESG ratings, which we could talk a little bit more about. So we got to get away from the politics and the legal and get into a management evaluation of DEI materiality and impact. And I think that some of the global standards will begin to help corporations guide towards and boards of directors getting a deeper understanding of that.
Well, Alan, that really raises a great point. Thank you, Eric, because Alan, you're also an expert and I'm going to say this definitively. You are an expert in human capital management. I think you wrote one of the very first books on the subject 25 years ago as an economist. You've written about, you've been involved with all sorts of initiatives, and now I understand you're managing director of the human capital practice there, or whatever that title might be. So let me ask you a question, Alan, that relates to this. Eric raises the issue that we don't really understand the impact of DEI. Don't you? Isn't that because in many cases companies aren't really measuring the impact of people? That literally 80 to 90% of our balance sheets are under goodwill with very little accounting for it, and that very few companies measure human capital ROI, human capital, value add, even such basic measures as, retention costs and blah, blah, blah. Is part of this the fact that we really don't, that human capital management is not really understood fully? I don't, to your point, Dorian, how many securities analysts at the annual meetings are saying, hey, what is your human capital ROI? What's your human capital value add? Alan, are we flying a little blind in this whole area of human capital, or am I mistaken and companies really are doing a great job of managing impact of people.
You're mistaken. No, just kidding.
Oh yeah, I could have been.
No, this has been, I've been in this business, I guess, for over 30 years, and this has been a constant, sort of failing of HR, talent management, human capital management, whatever you want to call it. And certainly DEI within human capital management is probably amongst the least measured and understood, to Eric's point. But yeah, overall, I think it's gotten better. I think that after 30 years of most of the most prominent uh, experts in this field, people like Dave Ulrich, people like John Boudreau, in the major universities and colleges and consulting firms, continuously saying that we don't do a good enough job, measuring the impact of human capital initiatives, that there's been some progress, but it's still, lagging that of many other components of the business, certainly sales, marketing, finance, obviously. So is it part of the problem? Absolutely. And I think if organizations could do a better job, especially now, of linking DEI uh, investments to business outcomes, then we would have far fewer detractors. People would understand that, not every DEI initiative, obviously, some do waste time and money, just like initiatives in any other part of the business. But the DEI initiatives that work contribute to the business bottom line. And in doing so, raise the fortunes of every person in the company. But we need to show that in a much better way than we have in the past, especially.
And
Go ahead.
Bruce, if you don't mind me interjecting here, I hope
Please.
we take Alan's last comment and use that as a theme or soundbite. I think you summarized it very well. If companies do a better job of showing how their DEI efforts are reflected in the bottom line or lower employee turnover, however they want to measure it and communicate that, then there'll be far fewer detractors because you would have made the business case, the ROI of DEI. And we need to figure out how to amplify what Alan just said and get that across the board. So let's quote Alan and get that out there into the business community as much as possible. And then let's get busy absolute executing that and showing them how to do it, or finding the people who are doing it and elevate what it is that they're doing.
Well, and that's the purpose of this show, to actually lay the groundwork for a constructive discussion. Alan, I do want to go back to you for one little minute on that. First off, I think the trouble is a lot of the research is been focused on process and not on outcomes, and that's one of the problems, right? The research will look at, what is what a company doing successful to recruit more people, when to me the real issue is what is the impact of that. And to me, it's very simple. 18% of the United States is, I believe, or 14%, I believe, is Black. And I think if you add Hispanics, you're up to 28% or something. So if your marketplace is not of customers and supply chain partners isn't reflecting of that, to Eric's point, to me, that's a warning. How do you grow? You grow by getting new markets. And when you look at the demographics of most companies in the US, they still favor white people in most cases. So, and if you have a company, Alan, that is 60% white, everything else is going to be 60% white because relationships naturally lead to people gravitating to their own circles. So, Alan, isn't it isn't there really a lot more research on the impact of human capital than in a sense we may not really need that much more, because you have a ton of research that can prove the value of human capital, or pretty convincingly, and we now have the people at Irrational Capital, very reputable organization that has created what's called the human capital factor, which has identified a clear link between future value creation and having high rates of employee engagement, and that includes diversity. So I think, Alan, I don't we really probably there's not much research that proves that if your company is all white, you're going to do better. I don't think it's an issue of research, is it, Alan? It's really, to Dorian's point, an issue of focus. Are we going to focus on virtue signaling, or are we going to focus on how can we have a bigger market for our products and services? Is that maybe that's a bad question, but I mean, really, don't we already have the proof? Do we
It's
really
just,
need more proof?
well, here's what we have, right? We have more than enough research to build a solid business case for DEI, and I'll talk about that as succinctly as I can. What we need beyond that are better definition and application of measurable KPIs that demonstrate at a company organization level directly investment in DEI business outcome. So Dorian said retention. So what we need is for organizations to draw that connection between an investment in diversity or belonging or inclusion, what have you, to improved retention. We can get into all the nuances of that. We don't want to retain everybody, but the people we do want to retain. We also know that there are various factors that go into retention. We can never say that an initiative that we launched 6 months ago is directly and 100% responsible for an improvement in retention a year or 6 months later. But we can, through ROI methodology and other tools, make a really good estimation of the impact of an initiative on something else that is a business outcome. So that's what we need. Do we need more research? I don't want to say we don't, because I put myself out of a job, but there is a very solid case for DEI. And here's what I'll just say on that, without going into all the 30, 40 years of research by so many different top flight consulting firms based on really good data. It's beyond question. What I would do if I were making this argument is just point to what companies are doing. And I don't want to downplay the DEI backlash in the political situation, but the great majority of organizations, even the ones that you see in the headlines, are not stopping what they're doing for DEI. They're scaling back some initiative, and they're actually increasing others. The great majority, from our own research, from not just our research, I can cite, just off the top of my head, Workday's research in 2024, the Conference Board research, Bridge Partners research, that over 80% of organizations are either holding the amount of investment in DEI in 2025 or increasing it. The amount that is increasing it is larger than the amount that is decreasing it. So overall, despite all the headlines we're seeing, organizations are staying with DEI. One of the best measures I've seen is last year, by far the greatest number, even more than ESG, the greatest number of challenges made by shareholder activists were around DEI. Do you know the percentage that was successful?
Very few.
2%.
Yeah.
So in all of these efforts to get shareholders to abandon DEI, only 2%, I should say 2% support amongst the general shareholder population. So 98% of people listened to their arguments and said, forget it, we're sticking with DEI. That goes hand in hand with more than 80% of CEOs saying, we're continuing DEI or expanding DEI. That goes along with our research that shows that 67 to 70%, I don't know the exact numbers, and it varies by question we ask, but favor DEI, and these are employees, favor DEI in the organization, value diversity, and see and report, a business impact of DEI along the lines of retention, well-being, these sorts of factors. And we have all this research. It's all very recent. But these are the kinds of things I would put together if my company were considering dropping DEI. If you just look at, and you mentioned demographics. So we all know that by 2050, 2055, we're in a majority-minority environment in the United States. We're rapidly becoming a country that has no racial majority. Our research shows that already the great majority of the workforce values DEI. What I mean by that is generally 67% of workers, men, women, black, white, whatever, say that they value DEI. When you cut it by women, half of women say they would not work in an organization that does not take DEI seriously. That's half of women. When you say black women, it goes up to 2/3. We're talking about already just women, half the workforce. You add you add millennials who also have report higher importance on DEI. You add other minority groups, and you've already in 2025, the majority of the workforce would not or would only reluctantly work for an organization that doesn't take DEI seriously. And I know we're talking about customers and suppliers and everyone else today, but that's, as you say, Bruce, that cascades across all the stakeholder groups. So let me just say any organization that is significantly scaling back or eliminating DEI is taking their future into their hands in the wrong way. You know, they're at great risk.
And
Well,
Bruce, if I
Dorian,
could,
you actually have an
add
example.
something
Well, Eric, I'm going to
to,
get to you in a second. I wanted to
okay,
get
sure.
Dorian here. You know, this whole issue, growth comes from markets. It grows, like, for instance, WD-40. Everybody knows that little blue can. Well, back in 1980, it was only sold in the US. And a new CEO came in, a guy named Gary Ridge, who's, I think, a terrific leader. And he basically said, we're going to grow this product worldwide. And if you look at the stock value of that company, no one's known this, but it was almost like a Nvidia. If you put $10 in WD-40 when Gary joined, and it's almost looks like Nvidia. Why? Because he expanded his markets to all over the world. So isn't Dorian, you worked for a company for IBM. IBM is a worldwide company. How can you have a worldwide company without diversity and equity and inclusion? I mean, what was your experience there about making it part of the culture rather than a flag wagging virtue signaling exercise?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And we always look for models of success. Who's doing it right and amplifying that to get going. When Tom Watson wrote the book of Business and Its Beliefs, one of the things he said is that if business doesn't regulate itself, then government will step in and it will do it poorly. And so, again, I put this back to the corporate leadership and not taking this seriously enough and being effective enough in implementing some of these strategies. When you first started working at IBM used to say three things. We had three basic beliefs. And Alan, since you're a researcher, you probably know these. One, respect for the individual. Number two, best customer service possible. And number three, pursuit of excellence. And that was drilled into every IBM. Those were corporate values that we all embrace. Respect for the individual. That sounds like inclusion, doesn't it? Best customer service possible. That sounds like creating value. Pursuit of excellence. Let's always try to figure out how to do it better for servicing our customers and better for our employees as well, so that we can get the most out of them. And so if we just go back to some basics and amplify this and update it, and IBM spent thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars with industrial psychologists or whoever to put this together. If we go back and grab the best practices and promote it, we should. I remember one other thing. A manager at IBM once said, if you go to IBM France, guess what you'll see? French people. They're the ones who are managing it. They're the ones who are on top of it. And that's because they're the ones who know the culture. And they're the ones who know the marketplace. JP Morgan today just promoted 2 Indian executives, according to Bloomberg, to managing director. Why? Because the market in India is growing so large, it's huge. You want people who are culturally competent and culturally comfortable so that they can guide the company in the biggest way possible. That's what visionaries do. So it goes back to culture. It goes back to ROI, and it goes back to DEI and inclusion. So just respect every employee, give them opportunity to advance, focus on the customer, and I'm sure other businesses and companies have comparable mission statements, and Alan has probably collected much of them, or they're members of the conference board, or they've been to his institute. Maybe that's it. They've crafted it, but that's really what you want to do. Now, not every industry approaches every demographic, but it doesn't matter. You still want the best ideas that you can get from the broadest range of people. And as you said, Bruce, the culture, the American culture is moving, and our global culture, as companies go overseas, they have to deal with more diverse cultures. So that's how we respond to that. That's what you need to do, and just find other examples of who has done it right and who is doing it right and why they've done it right.
So, Eric, I interrupted you. I have a question for you, but I first, did you hang on to that thought that you wanted to make?
No, you can go ahead with the question. I think I'll be able to cover it, but
Okay.
basically,
Well,
yep.
I really want to kind of move into the positive element of this. You obviously, working for the NACP ETF, which is the impact fund. So, and then of course with the ICCR, you look at this from an investment standpoint. Alan gave some pretty good recommendations, I think, for how companies should look at this. You're from the investment standpoint. What do you think are the questions that investors should be asking? Not from the standpoint of what are you doing to restore true equity to this country, or restore, I should say, implement true equity in this country. But what is your recommendation to investors as to the questions to ask? What should be investors be aware of that's material?
Yeah. Well, I think it gets to again the issue of measuring value, right? Uh, we have corporations now that are not focused in on that measurement process. And that's why I point to the idea of double materiality. I think the double materiality assessment, impact materiality, financial materiality, you have, and I don't think we should be so dismissive of the right wing because they're asking really hard questions. Let's focus in on shareholder value. From an investment standpoint, let's look at pecuniary factors, things that affect the bottom line. I think the left wing and a lot of the work that I've seen has focused too much on the social justice side and not focused in on the financial materiality side. And again, this is nothing new. I mean, the idea of double bottom line investing has been around for decades. But if you focus exclusively on, the social side is viewed as social engineering, but if you don't deal with the issue of financial materiality. So in the case of human capital, Alan's work and many others' work is really trying to figure out a way to measure that in a way that impacts corporate profits. And some from the left wing may say, well, that's those are the capitalists, but that's business. Business is about being able to measure returns and shareholder value creation, and that's not out of bounds. So I think there has to be some balance here, and I think that materiality, financial materiality of DEI initiatives is fair. And one other point I'd like to make: when you see these protests, these boycott campaigns, particularly in the African American community, and this is going to be massive. What they're saying is we're material.
Hmm.
Target, we're spending money with you. So if corporations continue to put out these reports, ignoring their stakeholders, not including them in the process, then they find themselves in the situation that Target is in right now, where folks don't feel like that you really value the customer base that's spending money. And what they're really saying at the end of the day, we're material. So before companies just dismantle their DEI programs, that's why they have to be very, very, very careful not only from the standpoint of the left and the right. And so we have to get to this issue of measuring value. We have to go to those standards of double materiality. And boards that don't do that are going to be flying in the blind.
Well, and I think they are. And by the way, folks, if you don't understand, double materiality is a concept that came out of the European Union as part of its new corporate sustainability reporting directive, which has made a lot of news in Europe, but not here. But essentially, it means evaluating the risks and opportunities you create for all your stakeholders in the environment and the risks and opportunities that those stakeholders create for you, i.e., double materiality. Alan, moving toward the conclusion here, in terms of materiality, there's a great example of this in the trucking industry. The trucking industry is obviously has a lot of labor issues because a lot of people don't want to drive, right, overnight, long distances. So they finally woke up to the fact that having an all-white trucking industry was not really going to work. So they began to recruit, and this is about 10 to 20 years ago. They began to recruit from African Americans and more lately women. And what they found was they were sending white men to recruit black men. And then they were bringing the black men to the restaurants where the white guy ate, where everybody around them was white. And what they realized that that was not a very effective recruiting tactic. And so they obviously began to hire more black people, and they had black people being recruiters. But here's the real joke. The industry, while it has now become very diverse, in terms of truckers, and it is increasingly diverse. My understanding is when it comes to senior management at all those companies, it's still all white male. So the question then really becomes if we've learned that you needed to have black people to recruit black people, right? Then, or you need to have women recruiting women, then wouldn't it make sense to have boards, to your point, Dorian, and management reflecting the marketplaces that you're trying to attract? This, to me, Alan, is where the materiality comes in. You cannot understand a market if you aren't of that market. Like you said, Dorian, you don't bring in a Yankee to run France. I'm sorry. You bring in a French person, woman, man, whatever. So, Alan, to me, with all of this evidence that DEI really is a source of value creation, personally, I am still very optimistic for the long term, personally, but I'm going to get your opinion. And you know why? I do believe that capitalism and free markets eventually ring out stupidity. And as Dorian said, if we don't do it, if business doesn't do it, government will, and there are going to be other administrations. But Alan, where do you think DEI is stalled? Like from what you said, you don't think it's stalled. Where do you think it's going?
Well, first, just want to address that point you made about the senior leadership, let's say. We have to be careful too. It's not a matter of, Dorian talked about the importance of culture, so I'll build on that. Um, there's a very good saying, you can't just stir in diversity and expect some miracle to happen, right?
Right.
Right. You need to have all the other pieces in place so that a diverse team is actually not less productive than a homogeneous team, because it will be if you don't have the other ingredients, because you've suddenly introduced friction that wasn't there in the past. To get the benefits of diversity, there have to be an awful lot of other, let's say, cultural elements, the respect for the individual that Dorian mentioned, um, the properly functioning teams, the psychological safety, and go on and on and on, right? It's far more complicated than just being diverse. And then we keep talking about diversity in terms of women and race, when of course there are so many other dimensions that we haven't talked about yet. But all that to say, I agree with you. I think DEI is going through a period that's making it more difficult for leaders and organizations to operate those programs, or having to review them, make sure of the legal reputational risk, needing to do things to show the value more than they may have in the past. Um, but this is just this is a blip. The pendulum swang arguably too far after the murder of George Floyd, where you may have looked at someone of a certain race or gender and made them the CDO. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of CDOs weren't qualified. Let's. This is we published an article about the um, the requirements of the CDO position, really analyze what a CDO would need to do to be successful beyond having a real authority, beyond having a real budget and a real team, things supplied by the organization. They also need an incredible range of skills, um, you know, building coalitions for one thing, exerting influence, and when you don't have direct line reporting, trying to get other people at the level and below to align with what you want to do. These are really difficult skills that take a lot of experience, and putting people into those positions who weren't qualified really helped, I think, accelerate the backlash. Putting people into management positions who aren't ready because of their gender or race is no good for them and no good for uh, getting out of the situation that we may be in with the backlash. It'll just further the backlash. So it takes time. We have a much more diverse workforce now. Whenever we do surveys in organizations, we see that general workforce diversity usually looks pretty good in the United States. There are some exceptions. As soon as you hit management, it starts to look a little, red flags start to raise. And then when you hit the executive core, there are pretty much solid red flags. Where clearly the organization isn't diverse by the various factors we survey for. But there's been progress. Far more women in leadership, far more African Americans in leadership, far more Hispanics in leadership. Um, it just takes time. I'm not making an excuse for it, but I'm answering your question, Bruce. Let me just share a little bit more data on that. I looked up for one of our research the market for D&I, and there's a lot of details that go into it. But in 2022, it was worth about 9.4 billion globally. So this will be your consulting, your tools, and these sorts of things. It's projected to reach 24.4 billion by 2030, despite what's going on. That's a 12.6% growth rate year over year, much higher than many other parts of the business. And again, I just point to the data that we produce when we survey senior leaders. Over 80% remain committed to DEI, despite the backlash in the political situation. So yeah, DEI is alive and well, far, far from dead, for sure.
Dorian, you've been at this a long time. What's your view?
Well, I think first of all, I agree with Alan has said a lot, and I would say who made those hiring decisions of CDOs that weren't qualified, and I would argue that that shows the blind spot at the board and senior management in thinking this is what we need to do. And I think we need to take a critical look at how it was done, how the DEI infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, was put in place. So it was an overreaction, and maybe in some cases, unqualified people were put in positions. But the people that I talk to, we never want an unqualified person in any position. And we certainly don't on promoting DEI and inclusion, saying that quality goes down. On the contrary, we say that there's a large pool of educated, trained, skilled, ready to be engaged and involved. And we've got to figure out what that barrier to entry is, or that barrier to promotion is, so that they don't come in, get disillusioned, and then leave. So, or that you find them and start looking in other places and bring them in as well. So I think this is a blip. I'm constantly reminded that there was a time when alcohol couldn't be consumed. Remember that? Prohibition. And we saw this during the Reagan administration, that the politics moved to the right.
Mhm.
And at that time, and Eric could talk about this, Ben Hooks and Fred Rashid and Earl Shinhorst at the NAACP came up with the NAACP Fair Share Program, where they would have voluntary negotiations with corporations and say, we like to see board diversity, employee and promotion. We like to see supply diversity, and you give money in communities. And 75 corporations signed those agreements at its peak. Companies like Coors, companies like Disney, McDonald's, Wendy's, and others. Again, Eric could talk about it even more. But uh, the, the the economy is moving in that direction, as Alan has pointed out. And I'm so glad that Alan is here and Alan has the research. Now let's pull it all together. And instead of being a single soloist, Alan, or small group barbershop quartet singing this tune, we need to come together and have the Mormon Tabernacle Choir of corporate DEI singing how the ROI of DEI and how to do it right from the top down.
Beautiful. Eric, you get the last say on whether you're optimistic for the future or whether you think that we're hitting a wall.
I think there is going to be a fundamental change in the way that DEI is done. And again, it goes back to this issue of value creation and measuring it in a way that even for both the left and the right of this issue, that we begin to evaluate those pecuniary factors. I think that without that, without there being some sort of basis uh, for looking at the impact of diversity initiatives, I think that there's going to continue to be this backwards and forwards and not finding the middle ground. I think also boards are going to have to do assessments going forward. Uh, one final thought I would say is that Alan Edmonds, who from London Business School, did a really interesting study. Simply looking at diversity data is not enough. It's going to require a deeper examination of those practices. And what he said in the paper, which I thought was really interesting, and I've cited it, is that there's a correlation between diversity in earnings, but it's not yet reflected in the earnings of corporations, which means that uh, if you dig deeper, you could discover the value, but it's going to require work. It's going to require a deeper dive beyond just looking at demographic data. One final thing I will say is that one of the creators of the Morningstar Minority Empowerment Index is Sustainalytics. And this is what they said in terms of the impact of the S of ESG in terms of ESG scores. What has to be discovered is what is performative and what is actually material. So the idea of understanding the materiality of DEI and evaluating it, is going to be very, very, very critical. And until we get through that period, until boards take that seriously, what we're going to have is this tension, the equivalent to greenwashing, boards trying to hide the numbers without addressing what is really, really important to their bottom line. And that's the materiality of stakeholders, employees, and other stakeholders in the group. They have to evaluate that. I believe if they don't, that's a violation of their fiduciary responsibility.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that. And we have 2 more minutes. So, Alan, I'm going to ask you a question. I know you're not an attorney, but one thing that really strikes me is that there is an enormous schism in this country between low income and high income. If you are low income, I don't care what color you are, you've got major disadvantages versus if you're middle class or upper middle class. So, isn't one way, the Germans are very big into apprenticeships. Isn't one way for corporations to take advantage of all this undereducated talent that would be completely compliant with the Supreme Court? Schools and businesses could make income a factor in who they're giving scholarships and training to. So, for instance, IBM could say, okay, we're going to develop a whole training program for AI technicians, and we're going to provide subsidies or scholarships to low income people, not based on race, not on ethnicity, but on income. because, and yeah, I'll bet you when it comes to income, yeah, blacks and Native Americans and women are probably lagging behind whites. But isn't income still allowed under these new guidelines? You can still provide scholarships and support based on, and schools can still do that, right? Stanford can give all the scholarships they want. They can't do it on race, but they can do it on income. Or am I mistaken?
No, you're right. In fact, Harvard just came out. Now, I don't know with Harvard losing
Hmm.
billions of dollars in grant money and so on, it's going to stick. But they announced just a couple of weeks ago that any family with income of 200,000 or less is going to get quite a bit of aid for a qualified a person who otherwise qualifies to attend Harvard. And Dorian's surely on top of this. And if I'm misstating anything, let me know. But I think under 100,000, it's a full ride at Harvard. And you know, Harvard's just an example, but most of the Ivies, most of the students are not paying nearly what the ticket price is because there's so much aid and it's particularly directed at socioeconomically. And now I think you might be asking, is that I don't know. I don't know the other part of that question, but yes, absolutely. That's happening at the school level. The business, do businesses do the same? I believe so. I don't have any good examples of this. Um, but
I don't think income is a is a I think it's a permissible criteria as long as it isn't racially or gender based. But we're not attorneys here, people, and don't
Well,
uh, you know
Bruce, if
make
you
this.
don't mind, let me see if, and I think we're getting to our limited time, but
Yeah, we
let,
are done.
let me give you
And the
two
last
examples.
word.
and
Let
I
me
have
give
a,
you two examples. When I was a kid growing up in New York City, there was a program called Upward Bound, and that's the Department of Education. And it was specifically for people who were first generation college students, college bound. And so that had nothing to do with race. It was all across the board. And we would go for Saturday training classes to prepare us to go to college. Again, not race based at all, although you could say that a lot of racial people by race were first gen, but it was all first gen. That's all. So no matter who you were, what your background was, at rural, urban, or anything like that. And then on the supplier side, the government has a program called Hub Zones, and your business, all it has to do is be located in a low moderate income community and employ low moderate income individuals from that community, and it gets a government preferential on its contracts because that's good public policy, that's reasonable public policy. So smart people hopefully will craft and figure out ways of advancing economic opportunity that are legally compliant or reduces the risk of dealing with the courts, or have the courage to stand up and fight back and say, no, we'll defend this because there is a legacy and a history of all of these programs where we've done this before. Oh.
Well, we could took so much more,
So I
but you
can't
know,
wait for the next one, Bruce. Clearly, this needs to be a three-part series. And so,
well, yeah, you've been so generous with your time. We'll see about that. But anyway, Alan, did you want to say one last thing, or are
no,
you?
no, I'm on another, I have another meeting at 2, so I have to jump. That's
Okie doke.
it.
Adios. Thanks to
Okay.
all of you
Thanks,
folks.
nice meeting all of you.
yeah,
Okay.
it's a
Bye-bye.
pleasure.